Across modern Europe, warm homes, steel factories, and electric grids have been powered by a quiet lifeline stretching thousands of miles eastward. Here's what nobody tells you. The continent that once commanded global empires became deeply reliant on a single supplier for the energy that heats its winters and fuels its industries. And here's why this matters. When one provider controls nearly 40% of your natural gas, the balance of power shifts from markets to geopolitics, from price negotiations to existential risk. What looks like a commercial relationship becomes a strategic tether, one that can tighten or snap depending on decisions made far from the cities that depend on it. This is where the pattern begins. Dependency is never sudden. It grows through decades of convenience, cost savings, and political optimism. In the early 1970s, when Europe sought stable energy after repeated oil shocks, the Soviet Union offered something the world had rarely seen: vast reserves of gas beneath Siberia and the infrastructure to transport it reliably. The first major pipeline, completed in 1984, marked the start of an economic bond that seemed insulated from ideology. Even as the Cold War froze diplomacy, the gas kept flowing. Not peace, pragmatism. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. A new Russia emerged with immense natural resources and an economy in need of hard currency. Europe, rebuilding and expanding eastward, accelerated cooperation. By the late 1990s, Germany, Italy, France, and others were signing long-term contracts with Russia's state-backed companies. The logic felt irrefutable. Russian gas was abundant, cheap, and consistently delivered. At first, it looked like a miracle. Then the bill arrived. Here's what nobody tells you. Pipelines shape political futures. Once built, they lock nations into patterns of dependence for decades. You cannot reroute a winter in January. You cannot build a replacement supplier overnight. And you cannot erase the leverage created when one nation holds the tap that fuels another's survival. Europe's growing reliance was not malicious design. It was the unintended consequence of infrastructure. Metal tubes buried under soil created ties stronger than treaties. By the early 2000s, Russia's role had expanded dramatically. In 2003, its gas exports to Europe exceeded 120 billion cubic meters. By 2008, Europe's dependency topped 30%. Some economists argue that this growing reliance created a structural vulnerability that policymakers underestimated. Cheap energy lulled governments into comfort. Industries thrived under low costs. Households heated their homes with predictable tariffs. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. The warning signs began quietly. In 2006, a pricing dispute between Russia and Ukraine caused temporary supply disruptions. Several European countries experienced sudden pressure drops. It was a brief interruption, hours for some, days for others, but a preview of what could happen when geopolitics collided with infrastructure. Then, in 2009, a second dispute halted transit through Ukraine entirely, leaving portions of Eastern Europe without heat during one of the coldest weeks of the year. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored: the realization that Europe's energy network had a single point of failure. Still, the relationship deepened. New pipelines were proposed. Nord Stream 1, completed in 2011, delivered gas directly to Germany through the Baltic Sea, bypassing transit states. Supporters argued it would ensure smoother flows. Critics warned it concentrated dependency. But the numbers were compelling. Russian gas often cost less and came under contracts tied to long-term stability rather than volatile global markets. This is where the pattern begins to harden. Convenience masquerades as strategy until crisis exposes the truth. Through the 2010s, Europe shifted toward renewables but continued relying on Russian gas to balance intermittent energy sources. Wind and solar rose rapidly. Yet natural gas remained the backbone, easy to store, easy to burn, and crucial for heating. Meanwhile, Russia expanded pipelines and maintained a reputation for reliability. Through recessions, political rifts, and sanctions, the gas kept flowing. Analysts suggest that this continuity created an illusion of indestructibility, not stability, dependence. Then came a pivotal lesson hidden in plain sight. Europe's winters operate on a simple rhythm. Demand rises sharply from November to March. storage levels drop, and nations look east for replenishment. Gas storage operates like a battery for the continent. When full, Europe can withstand disruptions for weeks. When low, even a mild reduction becomes dangerous. Over multiple winters, fluctuations in supply exposed how delicate the system had become. Countries with insufficient reserves experienced price surges and rationing threats. Industrial sectors, chemicals, steel, fertilizers, faced soaring costs when gas tightened. Yet the deeper vulnerability remained unspoken. A single supplier could alter the entire continent's trajectory with one strategic move. Historical parallels exist. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo reshaped global politics by exposing Western dependence on Middle Eastern oil. In 1990, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait triggered a spike that rattled economies worldwide. These events revealed a pattern. Energy security is never just about fuel. It is about power. In Europe's case, Russia supplied not just energy, but leverage. The undisputed control of a resource so essential created a political tool more potent than any conventional weapon. You don't need armies to influence nations when you control the heat in their homes. Here's why this matters today. Modern Europe, wealthy, industrial, technologically advanced, built its prosperity on a foundation partly rooted in external energy, a foundation that looks steady until pressure is applied. When analysts describe the potential consequences of a supply cut, they don't speak in metaphors. They speak in megawatts lost, factories shut, households chilled, and economies strained. A 10% reduction could send prices surging. A 40% cut could trigger rationing. A full halt, some scenarios indicate, could push industries into emergency mode and governments into crisis management. The emotional cost is equally profound. Heat is not optional in winter. Across Central and Eastern Europe, temperatures regularly fall below freezing. Without consistent supply, even brief interruptions can endanger vulnerable populations. Natural gas is not just a resource, it is a lifeline, a silent pulse sustaining 450 million people every season. But early cracks had already been forming. Throughout the 2010s, European leaders quietly debated diversification. Liquefied natural gas, LNG terminals expanded in Spain, France, and the Netherlands. Norway increased exports. Yet the sheer scale of Russian supply and the entrenched infrastructure meant diversification moved slowly. Not rejection, adjustment. Still, the calculus remained unchanged. Russia could supply vast quantities cheaply and efficiently, and as long as the gas kept flowing, the underlying risk remained theoretical. Then a new kind of tension emerged, one not rooted in pipes or molecules, but in strategy. Some analysts argue that Russia recognized its energy leverage as more than economic. It had become geopolitical currency, and Europe, benefiting from decades of cheap, stable supply, underestimated just how deeply this dependency had shaped the balance of power. The question that now looms, the question only Section 2 will unravel, is this. What happens when a supplier holding 40% of Europe's gas decides to turn the tap, even slightly? And how does that single decision ripple through markets, governments, and the daily lives of millions? Because if energy is power, then a supply cut is not just an economic act. It is pressure. It is leverage. It is a test of resilience. And it is the beginning of a story that Europe never wanted to confront. When a continent depends on one supplier for 40% of its natural gas, every political tremor becomes an economic earthquake. And here's what nobody tells you. Modern Europe, with all its wealth, technology, and ambition, remains vulnerable to a commodity that cannot be easily stored, rerouted, or replaced at scale in the dead of winter. This is where the pattern begins. Not with crisis itself, but with the quiet, creeping realization that an energy relationship built over decades can unravel in a matter of weeks. Analysts suggest that if Russia reduces supply, even modestly, the consequences don't unfold slowly. They cascade. Markets react first, governments second, households last. And the world watches as a resource becomes a negotiating tool in conflicts far bigger than the pipelines that carry it. Here's the mechanism. Natural gas flows through Europe in real time. Unlike oil, which can be shipped globally by tanker, gas is defined by infrastructure, compressors, transit routes, storage caverns, and long-term contracts. If one segment falters, the entire network strains. When Russia adjusts supply, whether through maintenance claims, capacity decisions, or geopolitical tension, the impact is immediate. Prices spike within hours on European energy exchanges. Industrial consumers, who often buy gas on spot markets, face soaring costs that can render production unviable overnight. And when industries halt, the economic power of entire regions falters. A fertilizer plant in Germany cannot run without gas. A steel mill in Italy cannot maintain blast furnaces at reduced pressure. A chemical facility in the Netherlands cannot suspend operations without risking irreversible equipment damage. Energy is the bloodstream of modern civilization, and a disruption is not an inconvenience. It is a systemic shock. At first, it looks manageable. Diversify suppliers, tap storage reserves, increase LNG imports, then the bill arrives. Even with new LNG terminals operating across the continent, analysts argue Europe faces structural limitations. Liquefied gas must be regasified, and capacity is finite. Tankers reroute, but weather, global competition, and price volatility restrict flexibility. Norway supplies more, but its output cannot rise endlessly. Algeria holds potential, yet political constraints and infrastructure bottlenecks limit expansion. Not relief, substitution. And here's the trap Europe faces. Every alternative supplier comes with constraints, and every diversification effort takes time. Time winter does not offer. Gas storage can buffer shocks, but only if filled ahead of the cold season. A harsh winter can drain reserves by February. A mild winter extends breathing room. Some scenarios indicate that a severe cold spell across Central Europe would push storage to emergency levels within weeks if Russian supply dropped significantly. Other scenarios suggest that even with conservation measures, heavy industries would face rationing, forcing governments to choose between protecting homes or protecting economies. The danger wasn't what they saw, it was what they ignored, the speed at which interconnected systems fail once pressure exceeds capacity. But the most powerful effect of a supply cut is not physical scarcity. It is psychological. Once fear enters the market, speculation intensifies, and prices climb far above what fundamentals alone would justify. Consumers panic. Governments accelerate purchases to secure future needs. Traders amplify movements through financial contracts. The anticipation of shortage becomes a self-fulfilling dynamic. Let me show you exactly how this unfolds. A rumor of reduced Russian flows triggers a spike on the Dutch TTF hub, the benchmark for European gas. A spike raises electricity prices. Electricity prices increase production costs. Production costs raise consumer prices. Consumer prices fuel inflation. Inflation pressures central banks. And central banks, in turn, reshape interest rates, borrowing costs, and the trajectory of entire national economies. Not energy. Influence. This cascading chain explains why a gas cut becomes more than an energy issue. It becomes a macroeconomic event capable of reshaping political landscapes. Some analysts argue that widespread shortages could increase social pressure on governments, fuel protests, and accelerate political polarization. Others suggest that countries with stronger fiscal reserves may weather volatility better, creating uneven resilience across the continent. Either way, no nation escapes unscathed, and yet there is a counterforce forming. Europe has not stood still. Diversification efforts have accelerated with unprecedented speed. Germany, once deeply reliant on Russian gas, has constructed floating LNG terminals in record time. France has expanded its nuclear fleet. Spain, with extensive LNG infrastructure, has become a key re-entry point for global gas, though limited pipeline capacity constrains redistribution to Central Europe. Meanwhile, wind and solar deployment continues rising, reducing gas demand during warmer months. Here's why this matters. Each new kilowatt-hour generated from renewables is one less unit of gas Europe must import. Not dependence, transformation. But analysts caution that energy transition is a long arc, not an immediate shield. Renewable energy cannot quickly replace natural gas used for heating millions of homes and powering industrial boilers that require constant, controllable heat. Hydrogen, touted as a future alternative, remains expensive and limited. Heat pumps offer promise, but retrofitting the continent takes time. This is where the pattern becomes clear. Structural change moves slowly, while geopolitical crises move fast. Multiple scenarios shape Europe's near-term future. In one scenario, a mild winter, strong LNG flows, and full storage, Europe navigates the crisis with strain but avoids collapse. Prices remain high, industries face hardship, but households stay warm. In another scenario, a severe winter, limited LNG availability, and reduced Russian supply, governments may activate emergency protocols, ration gas, and prioritize essential services. Factories darken, energy costs soar, and recession deepens. A third scenario, more optimistic, sees accelerated investment in renewables, efficiency, and storage, creating long-term resilience, reducing Europe's vulnerability year after year. And a fourth scenario, more fragile, suggests the crisis could push nations into competing for resources, fracturing unity and reshaping alliances within the European Union itself. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. One of the most profound consequences of the crisis lies in the reconfiguration of global energy politics. Russia, losing a dominant customer, may pivot toward Asia, forging deeper ties with China and emerging economies seeking long-term contracts. Europe, in turn, may strengthen its relationships with the United States, Qatar, and North African producers. If this pattern applies broadly, the 21st century may witness a divide between energy blocs, nations exporting fossil fuels and nations accelerating their transition away from them. Energy becomes a geopolitical identity, not merely a commodity. And yet, the most enduring lesson emerging from Europe's dependency is this: sovereignty is not just a military or political concept. It is the ability to keep your population warm during winter. Energy shapes diplomacy. Energy shapes resilience. Energy shapes the margin between stability and crisis. Here's what nobody tells you. Europe's future will be determined not by a single winter, but by how the continent rebuilds its energy architecture after crisis. Whether it becomes more self-reliant, more interconnected, or more strategically cautious will define its geopolitical posture for decades. Not reaction. Redesign. But even as Europe accelerates transition, it remains tethered to the legacy of decades-old decisions. Pipelines laid in optimism, contracts signed in convenience, and infrastructures built on assumptions of eternal stability. The shift away from dependence is underway, but the question remains whether change can outrun the risks that still linger each winter. Because in the end, energy is leverage, energy is strategy, energy is power. And as Europe confronts a supplier capable of altering its economic heartbeat with a single decision, one truth becomes unavoidable. The battle for warmth is no longer about temperature. It is about influence, and the world that emerges when a continent decides it will never freeze again.